These events shook the Diet. An investigation was ordered, and the guilty were to be punished. Yet justice was uneven. Among the Christian rioters, only Fox was arrested, along with a few accomplices who were briefly imprisoned. For the Jews, the response was far harsher. Severe administrative measures were imposed. Any Jewish peddler or artisan found on the streets with goods or orders was to be seized, taken to the guard chamber of the marshal of the Diet, beaten with rods, and expelled from the city. This was the treatment meted out to Jewish craftsmen at the very moment when reform projects were filled with eloquent declarations about the need to draw Jews into handicrafts and productive labor. The unrest in Warsaw had consequences that reached far beyond the streets. The Diet could no longer postpone the Jewish question. Once the masses had begun to resolve it through violence, inaction became impossible. On the 22nd day of June in the year 1790, the four-year Diet appointed a special body called the Commission for Jewish Reform. Its members included Butrymovich, Yzierski, the Castellan of Lukov, a noble official holding a high provincial rank, and several other deputies. Yzierski soon emerged as the leading figure of the commission. He was an advocate of radical reform and possessed a clearer understanding than most of his contemporaries of the economic realities of Jewish life. Rejecting the popular slogan of transforming the Jews into useful citizens, he declared before the Diet that the Jews already were useful. For generations, he argued, they had formed the principal mercantile class of Poland. They had exported the products of the land abroad, bringing wealth into the country and sustaining its economy. To strengthen the financial position of the Jews, he insisted, was to strengthen the finances of the state itself, increasing the circulation of money by millions. Under the guidance of Yzierski and Butrymovich, the commission worked with intensity. It examined numerous reform proposals submitted by Butrymovich, by Thaddeus Chatsky, the renowned historian and publicist who also served as the intellectual leader of the Finance Committee of the Four-Year Diet, and by others. Butrymovich's proposal was drawn directly from his earlier publication, while Chatsky's plan, though similar in essence, reflected his own analytical approach to the economic and social structure of Jewish life. At the beginning of 1791, a crucial moment arrived in the long and painful struggle over Jewish rights in Poland. The Commission of the Diet, the parliamentary body entrusted with the task of reform, had completed its work on a project aimed at improving the condition of the Jewish population. The exact text of this project has not survived, yet it is clear that its foundation was built upon earlier proposals put forward by two men, Butrymovich and Chatsky, members of the commission who had repeatedly pushed for reform. But the Diet, the Polish parliament, was consumed by an even more monumental undertaking. The nation was preparing to adopt what would become known as the Constitution of the 3rd of May, a document intended to reshape the Polish state and save it from the forces of decay and foreign domination. Because of this immense task, the Diet could not devote itself fully to the Jewish question. The Jewish reform project was set aside, postponed in the face of the larger drama unfolding in the heart of the nation. Only after the Constitution was proclaimed on the 24th of May did Butrymovich again raise the matter. He insisted that the Jewish question could not be delayed. But then another member of the Jewish Commission stepped forward, Koloniewski, a deputy representing Bratslav in Podolia, a region in southeastern Poland. He argued that extending commercial rights to Jews would harm the interests of Little Poland, the historic region centered around Krakow. Koloniewski proposed his own plan, and the Diet, eager to avoid controversy, welcomed this as an excuse to postpone the issue once more. In June, the Diet was adjourned. It would not meet again until September. In this way, the Great Charter of Polish Liberty, the Constitution of May 3, 1791, was proclaimed without altering the status of the Jews in the slightest degree. It is important to understand what this meant. The new constitution did not change the feudal structure of the Polish Republic. It did not end the power of the nobility, the Zlachta, nor did it free the peasants, the serfs bound to the land. It did not dismantle the privileges of the gentry, the powerful landowners who held immense influence. Yet it did confer civil equality upon the burgher class, the townspeople who had long been denied full rights. It placed the representative institutions of the state on a more democratic basis. But the Jew, the Cinderella of the realm, as many contemporaries called him, was left out entirely. While the state attempted to renew itself, the Jewish population remained excluded from the new order, abandoned by the very forces that claimed to be building a modern nation. When the Diet reconvened in the autumn of 1791, the political atmosphere was tense and unsettling. Opponents of the new constitution were stirring unrest throughout the country. Civil strife and war with Russia loomed on the horizon. Yet even amid this storm, Butrymovik, tireless and unbowed, stood once more to speak for the Jews. He reminded the Diet that the Jewish people were an unfortunate nationality, a term used to describe a community trapped by its own helplessness. They were unable to rescue themselves and did not even know the direction in which their salvation might be found. Butrymovik demanded that the commission revise its earlier project and submit it again to the House, with amendments appropriate to the current circumstances. His plea was supported by Yezierski, another member of the Diet. On the 30th of December, Yezierski voiced a strikingly radical idea. In his view, the Jews were not merely potential citizens, but already useful citizens, contributing to the life of the state. The Diet adopted the motion, and the commission resumed its work. Yet the outcome was disappointing. After long deliberations, the commission arrived at a conclusion that seemed designed to avoid real change. It stated that to improve the status of the Jewish population, it was necessary to regulate its mode of life. But such regulation was impossible until the Jewish community was freed from its kahal debts. And the liquidation of those debts, the commission insisted, was a matter for the Finance Committee. In other words, the commission argued that reform could not begin until the financial burden of the communal administration was removed. The Diet accepted this resolution with relief. A heavy responsibility had been lifted from its shoulders. There was no longer any need to speak of Jewish reform or equality. It was enough to instruct the local courts to determine the extent of the kahal debts and to authorize the Finance Committee to wipe them out, using funds from the kahal itself or other special sources. Thus, under the pretext of settling Jewish debts, the very idea of Jewish reform was effectively liquidated. Relegated once again to the margins, the Jews turned to other means. According to several contemporary accounts, they sought to influence the government through the person of King Stanislav Augustus, using their connections at court. Jewish public leaders reportedly met in secret, electing 3 delegates to negotiate with the king for improvement of their condition. These delegates carried out their mission toward the end of 1791 and the beginning of 1792, using the royal secretary Piatoli as their intermediary. In these shadowy meetings and quiet negotiations, the Jews of Poland were attempting to do what the state would not do for them, to secure protection, recognition, and a place within the nation's future. But the political storm around them was growing. The nation itself was struggling for survival, and the Jews, caught in the margins of history, were forced to watch as the fate of Poland and their own fate became ever more intertwined. Not long after these stormy debates, a dramatic and almost ceremonial moment unfolded. A delegation of Jewish representatives was granted a special audience with the King of Poland, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, the last monarch of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The reception, according to contemporary accounts, was conducted with great solemnity. The king was said to be seated upon his throne, emphasizing the gravity of the occasion and the extraordinary nature of the meeting. Before the monarch, the Jewish delegates laid out their plea. They asked not for favors, but for rights, civil equality within the state, the right to acquire land and houses in the cities, from which they were largely excluded, the preservation of their communal self-government, embodied in the traditional Jewish communal institutions, and exemption from the authority of municipal magistracies, which were often hostile and discriminatory. Their demands touched the very heart of the Jewish condition in Poland, challenging centuries of legal inferiority. According to persistent rumor, the delegation went further still. It was whispered that they offered the king an immense sum, 20 million gulden, to be used toward paying the crushing royal debts that burdened the crown. Several influential leaders of the Quadrennial Diet were reportedly taken into confidence regarding this proposal. Among them was Hugo Kolodich, the radical reformer and intellectual force behind much of the constitutional movement. The secrecy surrounding the offer only heightened its dramatic aura, blending desperation, hope, and political intrigue. The king himself, so the story continues, attempted to use his influence to push the Jewish reform project forward, first through the Jewish Commission and then through the Diet as a whole. Yet his efforts came to nothing. The question was too old, too entangled in fear, prejudice, and political calculation. At this moment of extreme peril, when Poland itself stood on the brink of annihilation, even the most pressing injustices were deferred. The land was draining its last reserves of strength in a desperate attempt at inner renewal and outer independence, while the angel of death, as contemporaries felt, hovered relentlessly overhead. The final struggle of the Polish state was drawing near. The enemies of the Constitution of the 3rd of May, enacted in the year 1791 as a bold attempt to reform and strengthen the Commonwealth, now made common cause with the Russian Empire. These conservative elements, drawn largely from sections of the nobility fearful of losing their privileges, aligned themselves with a foreign power that had long obstructed all Polish progress. The result was the formation of the Confederation of Targowica, a political alliance established in the year 1792, which openly invited Russian intervention. Civil war followed in the summer of that year. Although Jews were formally excluded from political life and denied participation in the nation's decisions, they did not remain indifferent. Here and there, signs of sympathy appeared for those who took up arms in defense of the new constitution. In the city of Vilna, today known as Vilnius, Jewish tailors volunteered to supply, free of charge, 200 uniforms for the army fighting for constitutional liberty. In the towns of Sokochu and Puloy, Jewish communities contributed what little they could to patriotic funds. In Berdychev, a major Jewish center in the eastern provinces, Jews joined a delegation of local merchants that went out to greet Prince Józef Poniatowski, the commander-in-chief of the Polish army, and presented him with new instruments for regimental military bands, symbols of morale and unity. The price of war, however, was heavy. Jewish communities in Volhynia and Podolaya, regions repeatedly crossed by opposing armies, suffered forced requisitions from both sides. They were stripped of supplies, money, and goods in the name of military necessity. In the town of Ostro, the Jewish population endured the terror of bombardment when Russian forces shelled the city in July of the year 1792. Neutral in law, Jews were victims in fact. The catastrophe deepened in the year 1793, when the Second Partition of Poland was carried out by the Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Prussia. Russia annexed vast eastern territories, Volhynia, parts of the province of Kiev, Podolaya, and the region of Minsk. Prussia seized large portions of western Poland, including districts of Greater Poland such as Kalisz and Plock, along with the important port cities of Gdansk, known in German as Danzig, and Torun, known as Thorn. Once again, immense lands were torn away, along with hundreds of thousands of Jews who suddenly found themselves under foreign rule. The mutilated nation, racked by pain at this new dismemberment, erupted in fury. From this anguish was born the uprising of 1794. At the head of this national insurrection stood Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a man shaped by the spirit of revolution. He had fought in the American War of Independence and absorbed the ideals of the French Revolution, and from these experiences he derived a deeper understanding of liberty than most of the Polish nobility. Kosciuszko believed that no nation could be free while its peasants remained in bondage and its citizens unequal before the law. Even amid the desperate struggle to save the fatherland, he gave signs of genuine democratic conviction. To the oppressed classes, including peasants and marginalized townspeople, this revolution promised more than the preservation of noble privilege. It hinted at a different Poland altogether. The fervor for freedom spread to segments of the Jewish population. It revealed itself most vividly during the long and brutal siege of Warsaw in the summer and autumn of 1794, when Russian and Prussian forces encircled the capital. Every inhabitant was called upon to defend the city. The irony was bitter and unmistakable. Jews who only months earlier had been beaten in the streets by burghers and artisans, and expelled from the city by administrative decree, now stood beside those same men in the trenches. They dug ditches, raised earthworks, and answered alarm signals by rushing to repel enemy assaults. Amid the shriek of cannon fire, the whistle of bullets, and the thunder of exploding shells, Jewish volunteers fought shoulder to shoulder with other defenders of Warsaw. They suffered casualties, wounded and dead, yet their resolve did not falter. Courage replaced grievance, and danger momentarily erased old hatreds. Among these Jewish defenders, a bold idea took shape: the formation of a separate Jewish military unit, a legion that would fight openly and collectively for Poland. At the forefront of this initiative stood a remarkable figure, Berek Jaslovek. Berek Jaslovek was born around the year 1765 in the small town of Kretinga, then known as Kretingen, in the northern regions of the former Commonwealth. His early life followed a familiar path for a poor Jewish boy. He studied in a traditional religious school, known as a heder, where he learned sacred texts. From there, through determination and talent, he rose to become the agent of a Polish nobleman. That nobleman was Ignacy Jakub Masalski, the Bishop of Vilna, a powerful ecclesiastical and political figure. Entering the bishop's service transformed Berek's life. Masalski frequently traveled abroad, especially to Paris, the intellectual capital of Europe, and he took his Jewish agent with him. During these journeys, the young Berek learned the French language and observed the refined life of Parisian salons, where philosophers, aristocrats, and reformers debated the future of society. For the son of a provincial Jewish community, this exposure was revelatory. He glimpsed a new world and sensed the revolutionary ideas circulating through the air of Paris on the eve of the great upheaval that would soon overturn thrones and transform nations. These experiences would shape his destiny, preparing him for the extraordinary role he was about to play in the final, tragic chapter of Poland's struggle for freedom. During the years of the Quadrennial Diet, Berek Jaslowic, who had relinquished his former post under Count Masalski and had married in the meantime, resided in Praga, a suburb across the river from the capital city of Warsaw. The air of patriotic fervor, swirling through the city in those turbulent times, crystallized the vague impressions left upon his mind by years of contact with the Polish nobility and his travels abroad. The heroic figure of Tadeusz Kościuszko, the celebrated Polish-Lithuanian military engineer and national hero, along with the siege of Warsaw itself, gave form and urgency to these impressions. Berek understood that the moment demanded immediate action. The liberty of the homeland, the salvation of the besieged capital, where both Poles and Jews were equally confined and menaced by the foreign enemy, called for decisive courage. This was the instant to demonstrate that even the so-called stepchildren of the nation could fight alongside her sons and that they too deserved a share of liberty and dignity. In September of the year 1794, at the very height of the siege, Berek Jaslowic, together with Joseph Aronovic, son of Aaron, a fellow Jew of similar patriotic inclination, approached Tadeusz Kościuszko, the commander-in-chief of the Polish forces. They petitioned for permission to establish a regiment of light cavalry, composed entirely of Jewish volunteers. Kościuszko, recognizing both the valor and the symbolic importance of the proposal, immediately granted it. He announced his approval in a special army order, dated September 17, praising the patriotic zeal of the project's initiators. In his proclamation, he extolled those who remember the land in which they were born, and know that its liberation will bestow upon them the same advantages as upon the others. Berek was formally appointed commander of this new Jewish regiment, and a public appeal was issued for recruits and contributions to equip the volunteers. Berek's call to arms, published in the official Gazette of Warsaw on October 1, was a stirring blend of biblical solemnity and impassioned patriotism, written in the Polish language. "Listen, ye sons of the tribes of Israel," he implored, "all ye in whose heart is implanted the image of God Almighty, all that are willing to help in the struggle for the fatherland. Know ye that now the time hath come to consecrate to this all our strength. Truly, there are many mighty nobles, children of the Szlachta, the Polish nobility, and many great minds who are ready to lay down their lives. Why then should we who are persecuted not take to arms, seeing that we are the most oppressed people in the world? Why should we not labor to obtain our freedom which has been promised us just as firmly and sincerely as it has been to others? But first we must show that we are worthy of it. I have had the happiness of being placed at the head of the regiment by my superiors. Awake then, and help to rescue oppressed Poland. Faithful brethren, let us fight for our country as long as a drop of blood is left in us. Though we ourselves may not live to see this freedom, at least our children will live in tranquility and freedom, and will not roam about like wild beasts. Awake then like lions and leopards." Berek's rhetoric was blunt, occasionally naive, and his political reasoning imperfect. He called upon Jews to join the mighty nobles in the fight for liberty, seemingly unaware that the emancipation of the Jews was not assured by the freedom of the Polish nobility, a class in which men of humanitarian vision like Kościuszko were rare indeed. Yet Berek clung to the hope that participation in the struggle for national independence might elevate the social standing of the Jews, offering them recognition and perhaps a glimpse of equal citizenship. His inspiration was reinforced by the example of Jewish volunteers in Western Europe, particularly in France, where since the year 1789, Jewish men had joined the Garde Nationale, demonstrating civic virtue and patriotic dedication. Berek's fervor proved contagious. In a remarkably short period, a regiment of 500 men was assembled, hastily armed and outfitted with the limited resources provided by the revolutionary government and by voluntary contributions. Their appearance was that of militia rather than a polished military unit, yet their sense of duty was unshakable. Many of these men were handling weapons for the first time in their lives, yet they carried themselves with courage and resolve. The Jewish regiment's baptism of fire came on November 4, 1794, during the horrific assault on Praga by the Russian forces commanded by General Alexander Suvorov. On that fateful day, 15,000 Polish defenders perished in the entrenchments, in the streets, and in the waves of the Vistula River. Among them fell nearly the entire Jewish regiment. Artillery shells tore through the fortifications, and bayonets swept through the streets, leaving a trail of death that included men who had marched bravely into battle for the freedom of a homeland that had long regarded them as outsiders. Berek himself survived the massacre, fleeing abroad alongside General Zayon Kek, a loyal comrade in arms of Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko had been captured by the Russians slightly earlier, leaving Berek and the remnants of the Polish-Jewish revolutionary effort to seek refuge elsewhere. Initially arrested in Austria, Berek managed to escape, ultimately reaching France, where he joined a community of Polish exiles committed to revolutionary ideals. The following year, 1795, witnessed the Third Partition of Poland, a catastrophic event that erased the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map of Europe. Russia absorbed the dense Jewish populations of Lithuania, including the provinces of Vilna and Grodno, constituting the backbone of Polish Jewry. Prussia annexed the remainder of Great Poland, including Warsaw and the region of Mazovia, as well as the province of Białystok. Austria completed its territorial acquisitions in Little Poland, taking control of the provinces of Krakow and Lublin. From that moment onward, the fate of Polish Jews became inseparable from the policies of three foreign empires, creating a tricolored pattern of Austro-Prussian Russian dominion that would shape their lives, their culture, and their struggles for generations to come. Yet even after the Third Partition of Poland, the carving up of its lands was not entirely final. For a brief and flickering moment, the ghost of a semi-independent Polish state rose again and moved restlessly across the stage of European politics. 12 years after the final partition, Europe was reshaped by the will of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, later known as Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. With armies and treaties, he treated the political map of the continent like a game of pieces, creating and dissolving states almost at will. In the year 1807, after Prussia had suffered a crushing defeat at Napoleon's hands and after the signing of the Peace of Tilsit, Napoleon seized the province known as Great Poland from Prussian control. Out of this territory he created the Duchy of Warsaw, a small Polish state that existed under French protection. Its ruler was Frederick Augustus III, King of Saxony, a grandson of Augustus II, the last Polish king from the Saxon dynasty. 2 years later, in the year 1809, Napoleon defeated the Austrian Empire as well. From Austria's Polish possessions he tore away additional lands and attached them to the Duchy of Warsaw, enlarging this fragile political creation. Warsaw, freed from Prussian occupation, once again became the capital of a Polish state, after an absence of 12 years. The city stirred with revived hopes, as if a nation long buried had briefly drawn breath again. The Duchy of Warsaw, composed of 10 administrative districts drawn from Great Poland and Little Poland, was granted a constitution by its French patron. This constitution was relatively liberal by the standards of the age. It established 2 legislative chambers, the Diet, serving as a representative assembly, and the Senate, a body of higher officials. It introduced the Civil Code of Napoleon, the famous legal system that had recently transformed France. The fundamental laws proclaimed the equality of all citizens before the law. Serfdom was abolished. Privileges based on estate or class were formally swept away. Among those who listened closely to these proclamations were the Jews of Poland. They, too, allowed themselves to hope. The memory of Napoleon as the initiator of the so-called Jewish Parliament and the Parisian Sanhedrin, assemblies convened to address Jewish civil status in France, was still vivid. Many Jews believed that the same hand which had opened doors in Western Europe would now extend protection and equality to Jewish communities in Polish lands. But these hopes were destined to be bitterly disappointed. The very first year of the Duchy of Warsaw, spanning 1807 to 1808, coincided with a decisive shift in Napoleon's own policy toward the Jews of France. The Great Sanhedrin was dissolved, and soon afterward, on the 17th day of March in the year 1808, Napoleon issued an imperial decree that dealt a heavy blow to Jewish emancipation. For a period of 10 years, the operation of laws granting civil equality to Jews was effectively suspended across much of the French Empire. This humiliating decree marked a clear retreat from earlier promises and ideals. In Poland, this reactionary turn was eagerly seized upon by conservative and hostile forces. These were men who had learned nothing from the catastrophes that had torn their country apart and who still could not accept the idea of granting equality to a people they regarded as alien and unwelcome. Napoleon's decree provided them with justification and encouragement. In the spring of the year 1808, the government of the Duchy of Warsaw was compelled to address the Jewish question directly. Jewish communities had submitted petitions demanding civil rights, and elections to the Diet were approaching. The Council of Ministers, the executive authority of the duchy, already aware of Napoleon's decree, clung to it as a convenient escape. A report was presented to Duke Frederick Augustus, warning that a dark and dangerous future awaited the duchy if the Israelite population, present in large numbers, were suddenly granted full civil rights. The report claimed that the Jews possessed a national spirit foreign to the country and engaged in occupations deemed unproductive. The ministers pointed to Napoleon's suspension of Jewish emancipation in France as a ready-made instrument for avoiding the constitutional promise of equality for all citizens. To ensure that their course would meet with approval, the government of Warsaw entered into correspondence with its representatives in France and with the French foreign minister, Jean-Baptiste de Champagny, a statesman known for his hostility toward Jews. Once it became clear that Napoleon himself would not oppose such measures, the path was open. On the 17th day of October in the year 1808, Duke Frederick Augustus issued a decree that shattered Jewish hopes. It declared that inhabitants of the Duchy of Warsaw professing the Mosaic religion would be barred for a period of 10 years from enjoying the political rights they were otherwise entitled to receive. This exclusion was justified by the claim that the interval would allow them to erase the characteristics that, in the eyes of the authorities, separated them so sharply from the rest of the population. The decree added a final, bitter clause: individual Jews might be granted political rights before the expiration of the 10 years, but only as a special favor, and only if they proved themselves worthy in the eyes of the ruler and complied with conditions that would later be set forth in a separate edict. Thus, under the shadow of Napoleon, in a state that proclaimed equality and freedom, the Jews of Poland once again found themselves set apart, suspended between promise and exclusion, waiting while history moved forward without them. In the tumultuous years that followed the adoption of the Constitution of May 3, the Jews of Poland found themselves caught in a tightening net of political change and social hostility. The new Polish state, already weakened by internal division and external pressure, was being reshaped under the influence of French revolutionary ideas. Yet the promise of liberty and equality was not meant for all. In the case of the Jewish population, the language of reform was used as a mask to conceal a return to old prejudices. The government in Warsaw, speaking in the polite, modern tone of French political discourse, managed to strip the Jews of the rights the Constitution had seemingly granted them. The decree was phrased with careful, civilized words, but its meaning was brutal. It spoke of political rights, yet in practice it denied Jews even the most basic civil rights. In November of 1808, Jews were forbidden from acquiring patrimonial estates belonging to the Zlachta, the Polish nobility. They were barred from owning land in the same way as the Christian population. The humiliating restrictions on where Jews could live in Warsaw were revived. A decree issued in 1809 ordered Jews to move within 6 months away from the main streets of the capital, except for a small number of individuals, bankers, large merchants, physicians, and artists. This was a clear return to the anti-Jewish traditions of the old Polish and Prussian laws, which had long confined Jews to separate quarters and limited their rights. The Jewish community in Warsaw was alarmed. By this time, the city already contained a significant number of advanced Jews, men and women who had embraced the culture of Berlin, the intellectual center of German Jewish Enlightenment. These individuals had abandoned the distinctive marks of Jewish dress and appearance, hoping that by blending in they could secure equal treatment and rights. In January of 1809, 17 of these progressive Jews made a petition to the Minister of Justice, Lubensky. They argued that, by their moral conduct and modern dress, they had become indistinguishable from other citizens and were no longer unworthy of civil rights. They appealed to the second clause of the ducal decree, which promised special treatment for those who had eradicated their distinguishing characteristics. But Lubensky, one of the ministers who claimed to promote liberalism while serving a despotic system, replied with cruel sophistry. He argued that constitutional equality did not automatically make a man a citizen. Citizenship, he said, belonged only to those loyal to the sovereign and who regarded the country as their sole fatherland. He asked, with chilling cynicism, whether those who followed the laws of Moses could truly consider this land their fatherland. Did they not wish to return to the land of their fathers? Did they not see themselves as a separate nation? The minister dismissed the mere change of dress as insufficient. In his words, the echoes of Napoleon's own attitudes toward the Jews could be heard. The Polish minister had, it seemed, learned the harsh logic of Napoleon's policy. A policy that demanded assimilation and loyalty, yet denied Jews the rights of full citizenship. Yet not all Jews in Warsaw were willing to accept this humiliation. Beyond those who sought personal advantage through appearance and adaptation, there was a group influenced by the Berlin Enlightenment. These were men who believed that it was their duty to defend the rights of their people, to resist the injustice and to demand recognition. On the 17th of March, 1809, 5 representatives of the Jewish community of Warsaw submitted a memorandum to the Ducal Senate, the governing council of the duchy. Their language was not only one of entreaty but also of indignation. They spoke with a voice that carried the weight of centuries of suffering. They reminded the authorities that thousands of Jews, having lived in this country for many centuries, had as much right to consider it their fatherland as any other inhabitants. They spoke of the humiliation and oppression they endured, without fault of their own, for reasons that no one seemed able to explain. They called the treatment an insult to mankind. Contrary to the enlightened spirit of the age and to the laws of Napoleon the Great, they wrote, Jews were denied civil rights. They had no representation in the Diet or the Senate. They sorrowfully anticipated that even their children and descendants would not live to see happier times. They listed the burdens they carried. They paid heavier taxes than other citizens. They were deprived of the possibility of acquiring land, building a house, founding a family, erecting a factory, or engaging in commerce without hindrance. They were ordered out of the main streets of Warsaw. And most painfully, they were denied the fundamental liberties that citizens valued most, the right to elect their leaders and to be elected in return, to participate in civic life, not as outsiders, but as members of the nation. Is the land in which our fathers, paying heavily for this privilege, saw the light of the world, they asked, always to remain strange to us? The question was not merely rhetorical. It was the cry of a people who had given their labor, their loyalty, and their blood to a land that refused to accept them. They appealed to the Senate with a vision of a future where the tears of the fathers and children would no longer fall in vain. They begged for the day when they might enjoy the rights and liberties that Napoleon had granted to the inhabitants of the country, and which their beloved homeland recognized as the rightful possession of her children. In these words, the drama of Jewish life in Poland reached a new intensity. A people whose history was bound to the land and to its people, yet whose place within that nation was denied, stood at the threshold of a world that promised liberty but delivered exclusion. The struggle for recognition continued, not only against external oppression, but against the very definitions of nationhood and belonging. To the petition presented by the Jews, who described themselves as members of the Polish nation and declared their willingness to renounce their own national distinctiveness, the Senate of the Duchy responded with cold severity. Instead of sympathy, the senators submitted to the Duke a report devoid of compassion. In this document they asserted that the Jews themselves were to blame for the curtailment of their rights. According to the Senate, Jewish involvement in what were termed dishonest pursuits and a way of life allegedly harmful to the welfare of society had justified their exclusion. Before any rights could be granted, the report argued, Jewish life itself would first have to be reformed. To this end, it recommended the appointment of yet another committee charged with elaborating plans of reform. In truth, such a committee already existed. Since the end of the year 1808, a body of this kind had been at work, drafting a reform program closely resembling the projects once discussed during the Quadrennial Diet in Warsaw and those later formulated by the Parisian Sanhedrin, the assembly of Jewish notables convened under the authority of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. Like its predecessors, however, this committee served less as an instrument of change than as a respectable means of postponement. Through commissions and reports, the Jewish question was not solved but quietly buried. At precisely this moment, when the government of the Duchy of Warsaw rejected Jewish appeals for equality on the grounds of alleged lack of patriotism, there lived in Warsaw a living refutation of that charge. Berek Jaslowic, the celebrated hero of the uprising of 1794, resided and worked in the capital. His life stood as a shining example of devotion to Poland. After the collapse of the uprising, Berek had spent 12 long years wandering across Western Europe. During that time he enlisted in the Polish legions organized by General Jan Henryk Dąbrowski, military units formed in exile and attached to the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte. These legions fought in numerous campaigns across Europe, carrying with them the hope that French victories would one day restore Polish independence. In these Napoleonic wars, Berek fought as a Polish soldier among Poles, sharing hardship, danger, and glory. When the Duchy of Warsaw was created in the year 1807, following Napoleon's defeat of Prussia, Berek returned home at once. He was appointed commander of a detachment in the regular Polish army, his long service finally recognized by official rank. Yet the deepest dream of his youth remained unfulfilled. His vision of a permanent Jewish regiment fighting openly under the banner of Poland had vanished with the blood-soaked trenches of Praga, the Warsaw suburb where Jewish volunteers had fallen in great numbers in 1794. 12 years later, the brothers and sons of those fallen fighters were reduced to pleading for the most elementary rights of citizenship. Berek himself no longer pursued this cause. Years of war had made him a professional soldier, and his remaining energies were devoted entirely to Polish military service. It was not Jewish emancipation, but Polish patriotism and personal courage that inspired the final acts of his life. In the spring of the year 1809, war broke out between the Duchy of Warsaw and the Austrian Empire. During this conflict, Berek Jaslowic led his regiment against Austrian cavalry near the town of Kock, in eastern Poland. There, on the 5th day of May, after performing a series of daring and heroic feats, he fell in battle. His death marked the end of a life spent almost entirely under arms, in service to a fatherland that never fully accepted him. The Polish press mourned the fallen hero. Members of the political and cultural elite lamented his loss. One of them, Count Stanisław Potocki, a distinguished aristocrat, writer, and statesman, delivered a special address in Berek's honor before the Society of the Friends of Science in Warsaw, a learned institution devoted to scholarship and national culture. In solemn words, the orator declared that Colonel Berek had brought sorrow to the land of heroes when unrestrained courage drove him into the heart of the enemy. He reminded his audience that the fatherland remembered Berek's old wounds and former exploits, and that history would eternally recall him as the first to give his people an example of renewed heroism. In him, Potocki proclaimed, the image of the ancient Jewish warriors had been revived, those men of valor for whom, in distant ages, the daughters of Zion had once wept. For a brief moment, the Polish nation remembered the one Berek. But the thousands of his oppressed brethren were forgotten. The only tangible expression of gratitude from the fatherland came in the form of a special decree issued by the Duke of Warsaw. This decree permitted Berek's widow, struggling to support her children on a meager pension, to reside in those streets of Warsaw from which Jews were ordinarily barred. She was also allowed to engage in the sale of liquor there, an occupation otherwise forbidden to Jews within the city. Beyond this narrow exception, no civil privileges were extended. The Jewish population at large had no reason to hope for mercy, even in isolated cases. Under such conditions, it was hardly surprising that military service inspired little enthusiasm among the Jews, even after they had been formally allowed to serve in person. With rare exceptions, Jews chose to pay an additional tax rather than shed their blood for a state that imposed duties without granting rights. This arrangement was legalized by a decree issued on January 29 in the year 1812. The decree authorized the substitution of military service with a monetary payment, a ransom that collectively brought 700,000 gulden annually into the state treasury. Even as the Duchy of Warsaw stood on the brink of destruction amid the gathering storm of the War of 1812, it found time to strike another blow against the Jewish population. Acting on the initiative of Minister Tadeusz Lubianski, a leading government official, the Duke issued a decree on September 30 of that year. This decree forbade Jews, after a period of 2 years, from selling alcoholic beverages or keeping taverns. In practical terms, it threatened to deprive tens of thousands of Jewish families of their primary source of livelihood. Privately, the government justified this harsh measure by pointing to the anticipated expansion of the duchy's territory and the hope for restoration of Old Poland. In such a revived state, officials argued, strict economic controls would be needed to restrain the returning Jewish population. But these calculations rested upon faith in the invincibility of Napoleon Bonaparte. That faith proved illusory. Napoleon's power collapsed. The idol fell from its pedestal. The Duchy of Warsaw, a pale and fleeting shadow of Polish independence, dissolved like mist. Once again, the fate of Poland passed into the hands of the three powers that had partitioned it, above all the Russian Empire. For the millions of Jews now living in Russian-controlled Poland, there was no uncertainty about what the future held. Experience had already taught them what they could expect from their new rulers. Long before the cannon fire echoed through the streets of Warsaw, long before Barak Yaslovic and his Jewish regiment took up arms, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been a land in turmoil, its governance precarious and its fate uncertain. The first partition of Poland, in the year 1772, had already shaken the foundations of the nation, forcing the government into the hands of a permanent council. This council, comprised of 36 members elected by the Diets, the legislative assemblies of the Commonwealth, was charged with overseeing 5 critical departments: foreign affairs, police, war, justice, and finance. The king, at that time Stanislaw Augustus Poniatowski, presided over the council, a symbolic yet fragile figurehead amid mounting internal and external pressures. The council's authority, however, was short-lived. By October 6, 1788, the newly convened Diet declared itself permanent, refusing to disband as tradition demanded. This quadrennial Diet, as it became known, sat continuously for 4 years, laboring to craft a modern constitution that would eventually emerge on May 3, 1791. It was a bold attempt to stabilize the nation, yet it stirred civil unrest and drew the wary gaze of the Russian Empire, whose intervention would prove disastrous. During this period, the Jewish population of Poland faced pressures both old and new. Reformers like Kalontai, a radical member of the Polish Chamber, sought sweeping changes in Jewish life, envisioning the dismantling of centuries-old communal structures in favor of Polish governmental oversight. Other towns and regions, such as Lukov in the province of Siedlec, saw local officials, known as castellans, exercise significant authority over Jewish affairs, reflecting the complex interplay between Jewish self-governance and external supervision. The Jewish communities themselves were often burdened by enormous debts, accrued over generations to pay taxes, meet extraordinary expenditures, or borrow from municipal authorities, Catholic monasteries, and private creditors. These financial pressures were a recurring topic in the deliberations of the Polish Diets during the latter half of the 18th century, highlighting the precarious position of Jews caught between obligation and survival. Amid these trials, figures like Abraham Chatsky emerged, offering literary and practical proposals for the reform and management of Jewish communities. Chatsky's work, later reproduced in his book Rozprawa o Zadach, Inquiry Concerning the Jews, published in the year 1860, demonstrated the persistent concern over how to integrate or reshape Jewish life according to the desires of the surrounding Polish authorities. Ideas ranged from subtle encouragements toward agriculture and handicraft to more coercive measures, such as limiting Jewish religious autonomy or prohibiting traditional attire. These debates unfolded against a backdrop of broader social unrest, economic stress, and the encroachment of neighboring empires. The lands themselves were fractured, divided between foreign powers after successive partitions. Lithuania, or Zmud, corresponding roughly to the present government of Kovno, fell to Russia. Great Poland, including Warsaw and the Mazovia region, went to Prussia, along with the district of Białystok. Austria, meanwhile, consolidated its hold on Little Poland, adding the provinces of Krakow and Lublin to its possessions. Each new ruler brought different policies, different expectations, and different threats to the Jewish population. In these tricolored lands of Austro-Prusso-Russian dominion, the fortunes of Polish Jews would henceforth be inseparable from the politics, prejudices, and ambitions of 3 foreign empires, a reality that would define their lives for generations. Through all this, small towns such as Kok, near Warsaw, became microcosms of the broader struggle. Local leaders negotiated taxes, debts, and communal obligations, while Jewish communities sought to preserve tradition, religion, and identity in the face of constant upheaval. The intersection of governance, military struggle, and social reform created a tense, almost theatrical tableau, in which courage, survival, and ideology collided. Into this world stepped Berek Yoslowik, whose actions would soon transform these tensions into the drama of armed resistance, binding the fate of Jewish volunteers to the doomed cause of Polish independence. A new chapter of Jewish history now opened, darker in tone and heavier in consequence. With the disappearance of Poland from the map of Europe, a new power stepped decisively onto the stage. The Russian Empire, vast, autocratic, and deeply orthodox in spirit, now became the ruler of hundreds of thousands of Jews who had never before lived under its direct authority. This moment marked the true beginning of the Russian regime over Eastern European Jewry. Before the reign of Empress Catherine II, Russia had maintained what might be called a quarantine against Jews, whom official ideology labeled enemies of the Christian faith. For generations, Jews had been rigorously excluded from the interior of the empire, driven beyond its borders, and tolerated only in marginal frontier zones. That policy collapsed abruptly in the year 1772, with the first partition of Poland. In a single stroke, the Russian Empire absorbed the region known as White Russia, and with it a massive Jewish population. The number of Russian subjects suddenly swelled by hundreds of thousands of Jews, a group the state had previously refused even to admit. Together with this newly acquired province, adjoining the central territories of the empire, Russia inherited a complex and unfamiliar population, diverse in language, religion, and social organization. Among them were Jewish communities deeply rooted in Polish traditions of self-government, communal autonomy, and economic life. This was an inheritance the Russian state had neither sought nor prepared for. The question immediately arose, what was to be done with this unwanted legacy left behind by Poland? A ruler of cruder instincts, such as Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, who had reigned earlier in the century, might have chosen a brutal solution, perhaps ordering the mass expulsion of Jews from the annexed territories. Such measures would have been consistent with earlier Russian practice. But Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great, possessed a more calculating and statesmanlike mind. At the very time when she was formulating her celebrated instructions, a document influenced by Enlightenment ideals and intended to guide legislative reform, she could not openly sanction such barbarism. Moreover, mass expulsion would have contradicted the solemn promises the Russian government had already made to the diverse population of White Russia at the moment of annexation. These promises were set forth in a public proclamation issued by Count Zakhar Chernyshev, the first Governor-General of White Russia. In this placard, all inhabitants of the newly annexed territories, regardless of origin, religion, or occupation, were assured, in the sacred name and word of the Empress herself, that their religious freedom, personal rights, and the privileges attached to property and social estate would remain untouched. This was a political necessity, designed to secure loyalty and stability in a region newly brought under imperial rule. The Jews were included in this assurance, though with a significant reservation. The proclamation explicitly stated that Jewish communities residing in the cities and territories now incorporated into the Russian Empire would continue to enjoy the liberties they had previously possessed, in accordance with existing law and their rights to property. The text emphasized that the humanity of the Empress would not permit her to exclude Jews alone from the grace extended to all other subjects, nor from future prosperity under her beneficent rule, so long as they conducted themselves as obedient and faithful subjects and confined themselves to what the authorities defined as genuine trade and commerce. The condition was clear and revealing. Unlike other groups, Jews were promised imperial favor only on the basis of strict obedience and economic usefulness. Yet despite this qualification, the inviolability of their existing rights was formally guaranteed. From that moment forward, Russian policy was bound, at least in principle, by this pledge. One of the first acts of the new administration was to order a general census of the annexed territories. According to contemporary testimony, the Jewish population of White Russia amounted to more than 40,000 families, roughly 200,000 men, women, and children. In the same year, 1772, an imperial decree imposed upon them a head tax of 1 ruble per person, a substantial burden for a population largely engaged in small trade and crafts. Administratively, the new territory was divided into 2 governments, or provinces, Mogilev and Polotsk, the latter known in later times as Vitebsk. From the very beginning, the authorities showed particular concern for the efficient collection of taxes. To that end, they ordered that all Jews be formally affiliated with communal bodies known as kahals, the traditional Jewish councils inherited from Polish rule. Where such organizations did not exist, governors were instructed to establish them as needed. The kahal thus became an indispensable intermediary between the Jewish population and the Russian state. But questions of internal organization soon proved far more complex than issues of taxation. At this very time, the Russian Empire itself was undergoing sweeping administrative reforms. In the year 1775, Catherine promulgated the regulation concerning the governments, a law that reorganized provincial administration across the empire. A decade later, in 1785, she issued the Act concerning municipal administration, which restructured urban life and defined the rights and duties of various social estates, including merchants, burghers, and guild members. These reforms confronted the authorities with a dilemma. Should the Jews be absorbed into the general legal framework of the empire, classified according to existing estates, such as merchants in the cities, burghers, or members of trade guilds? Or, in view of their distinctive way of life and the communal autonomy they had inherited from Poland, should they be allowed to retain their own institutions as a form of internal self-government, governing their religious, social, and communal affairs? The problem was exceedingly difficult. On the one hand, Russian law aspired to uniformity and control. On the other hand, Jewish society did not fit neatly into the established categories of the empire. Catherine's legislation hesitated between these two paths. At times it leaned toward integration, at others, toward preserving Jewish separateness. The result was uncertainty and contradiction. This confusion was further intensified by the interference of local officials, many of whom acted arbitrarily, and by the old rivalries among the various social estates, each eager to protect its privileges at the expense of others. In this tangled web of reform, fear, and misunderstanding, the foundations were laid for a Jewish policy that would be marked, from the very beginning, by inconsistency, tension, and unresolved conflict. In the shifting political landscape of the late 18th century, the Jewish community of White Russia, an area roughly corresponding to parts of modern Belarus, found itself caught between the old Polish order and the new Russian imperial system. The Russian administration, seeking to organize and control the Jewish population, turned to the familiar structure of the kahal, the communal self-government that had long existed under Polish rule. In 1776, the Senate of the Russian Empire issued an ukaz, a decree, that formally sanctioned the existence of the kahal. The Senate viewed it primarily as a fiscal and administrative institution. It was convenient for the Russian authorities because it centralized the collection of taxes and the control of the Jewish population. Governor-General Chernyshev, a high-ranking official overseeing White Russia, implemented this policy by designating the Jews as a separate tax unit and even as a distinct estate. In the old feudal system, an estate referred to a social class with specific rights and obligations. The Jews were to be entered on special registers in towns, townlets, villages, and hamlets wherever a census was taken. The instructions were clear and strict. In order to ensure that taxes were paid regularly, kahals were to be established in which every Jew would be enrolled. Every Jew, or Zhyd, as the official documents called them, would need a passport from the kahal to travel, to settle in a new place, or to take a lease. The kahal would pay the head tax, a personal tax imposed on each Jew, and forward it to the provincial treasury. Thus, for tax purposes and for basic rights such as travel and business, every Jew remained dependent on the kahal, just as under the old Polish system. But the kahal was also given judicial functions. District and government kahals were established, with the latter acting as courts of appeal for disputes between Jews. Each kahal was assigned a number of elective judges. Only lawsuits between Jews and non-Jews were to be brought before the general magistracy courts. This arrangement, however, did not last unchanged. The government's commitment to the kahal system began to waver. In 1782, the Senate asked Governor-General Pasek, Chernyshev's successor, to investigate the legality of establishing special Jewish law courts. A year later, the government took a decisive step in a different direction. It recognized the rights of Jews registered in the merchant class to participate in general city government. They were allowed to elect and to be elected on equal terms with Christian members of the magistracies, town councils, and municipal courts. But the implementation of this reform faced fierce opposition. Christian merchants and burghers, the townspeople who controlled the economy and the municipal institutions, hated the Jews and refused to accept them as equals. They had grown accustomed to viewing Jews as citizens of an inferior grade. When Jewish candidates were elected to public posts, the Christian officials used every method of electioneering to reduce their numbers. The result was that Jewish interests suffered, especially in the administration of justice. At the same time, the administration itself began to turn against the Jews. The liberal Chernyshев was replaced by the anti-Jewish Governor-General Pasek, who sought to restrict Jewish economic activity to the benefit of the Zlachta, the Polish nobility, and Christian merchants. A contemporary Jew, who personally experienced these measures, reported that Jews were driven from their breweries and distilleries, their toll houses, and their inns, businesses that had formed the backbone of their livelihood. Thousands of families were reduced to beggary. New restrictions were introduced affecting business, handicrafts, and other trades. The depth of the crisis is revealed in a petition submitted in 1784 to Catherine II, the Empress of Russia. This petition, composed of 6 points, was filled with despair. The Jews complained that the administration had deprived them completely of their main sources of income: distilling, brewing, and selling liquor in the cities. They also pointed out that Governor-General Pasek had forbidden landowners to lease inns on their estates to Jews, driving many families to the brink of ruin. They argued that the municipal equality granted to Jewish merchants had not brought the expected benefits. Where Jews were a minority, not a single Jewish candidate was admitted to municipal or judicial office. Therefore, when a Jew went to law against a Christian, he risked becoming the victim of a biased verdict, because there was no co-religionist to intercede on his behalf, and because he was not familiar with the Russian language. Their grievances extended further. They described the arbitrariness of landowners who, contrary to agreements, imposed excessive rent on Jews who had built houses on their property, forcing them to abandon their homes. Sometimes houses were requisitioned for government purposes, or torn down to be rebuilt according to new official street plans, without any compensation. The magistracies, on the other hand, often compelled Jews who lived in townlets and villages but were registered as merchants or burghers in some city to build houses in that city. This forced them to spend their capital on construction, leaving them without the funds to run their businesses, and driving them into extreme poverty. In these petitions, the Jews of White Russia laid bare the tragedy of their situation. They were promised reform and equality, but the reality was a system that used law and administration to strip them of livelihood, rights, and dignity. The old kahal remained a chain around their necks, and the new municipal reforms became a trap that offered equality in theory but denied it in practice. The petition reached the hands of the Russian Empress herself, Catherine II, ruler of the vast Russian Empire and one of the most powerful monarchs of her age. In the year 1785, she forwarded the Jewish appeal to the governing Senate, the highest administrative and judicial body of the empire, for careful consideration. Yet she did not do so in silence. Accompanying the petition, she attached a formal resolution that revealed her general attitude toward the Jewish question. Her Majesty declared that it must be clearly stated that, since the persons of the Jewish faith had been placed by imperial ordinances on the same legal footing as other subjects, the guiding principle must be observed in every case: each individual was entitled to the advantages and rights associated with his profession or social estate, without regard to religion or national origin. In these words, Catherine presented herself as a sovereign committed, at least in theory, to equality before the law. Bound by this broad and liberal instruction, the Senate was compelled to address the urgent problems of Jewish life within the recently annexed western provinces, especially the territories of White Russia, formerly part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Yet the solution the senators ultimately produced was hesitant and conflicted, a fragile compromise shaped by competing economic interests, national anxieties, and rigid class distinctions. On May 7 in the year 1786, the Senate issued an imperial decree, known as a ukase, that both granted and denied the demands of the White Russian Jews. On one hand, the Senate refused to allow Jews to engage freely in the retail liquor trade within cities. This refusal was justified on the grounds that, under the new municipal regulations, the sale of alcoholic beverages was considered a monopoly of the city administration. Thus, Jews were excluded not because of their faith, the decree implied, but because of urban economic policy. On the other hand, the Senate extended a partial concession. Jews were granted the right to participate on equal terms with non-Jews in public auctions for leasing taverns and pothouses. In rural areas, an earlier order issued by General Pasek, a high-ranking imperial official, had forbidden landowners to lease distilleries and inns to Jews. The Senate now declared this order an unlawful violation of landowners' property rights. As such, Pasek's directive was annulled, restoring to estate owners the freedom to contract with Jewish tenants. An equally complex compromise was reached